Welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Carledge, and I'm passionate about helping you master your animal training skills using the most positive and least intrusive approaches. Here at ATA, we understand that navigating the vast challenges you encounter in training requires a comprehensive base of knowledge and experience. It's common to face obstacles and rough patches on your journey that can leave you feeling overwhelmed and stressed. Therefore, since 2015, we've been on a mission to empower animal training geeks worldwide. We've aided thousands in developing their skills, expanding their knowledge, boosting their confidence, and maximizing their positive impact on all the animal and human learners they work with. We are excited to do the same for you. Simply visit www.atamember.com, join our vibrant community, and geek out with us. And of course, in the meantime, enjoy this free podcast episode as we explore new ways to help you supercharge your training skills, grow your knowledge, and build your confidence, so that you can craft a life that positively impacts every learner you encounter. But we will start today's episode where I'm thrilled to welcome you all back into part 2 with my conversation with the awesome Tom Candy. And if you haven't listened to the first part of our conversation, you can find it in the previous episode on whatever app you're listening to this show on. In that episode, we explored Tom's work in the shelter environment and how he navigates what can be a very rewarding but also sometimes a challenging context to work in. It's definitely worth a listen. However, if you haven't, you're of course welcome to start here with part 2, where you're still going to gain a ton of insights to help you grow your skills, knowledge, and confidence in animal training, working with dogs, and in shelter environments. So let's dive in. Tom, thanks so much for coming back and hanging out with us again on the Animal Training Academy podcast show. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Excited to continue the conversation.
Continue geeking out. I'm excited too. We're going to benefit from your experience in the shelter world, but we're going to switch things up a little bit and also cast a wider net. I'm looking forward to your input, Tom, on, in this episode, how to best help the human side of the lead in shelters and beyond. And I believe you put together a wee list of a number of things that the listeners of this show can do just to help the human side of the lead. But before we get going on these items, when we caught up last week, I think it was, this is something you said that you're passionate about. This is what you wanted to talk about and share ideas around. What is it that you're seeing in this space and in the human side of the lead that made you choose this topic for this episode?
Yeah, so really for me, there's two things, and they both relate back to working in shelter and rescue. But the first is obviously a lot of dogs, and it depends which research you look at, but a large number of dogs that come into shelter and rescue are coming in because of their behavior. So whether that is a problem behavior in inverted commas, or owners just not able to cope with normal traits of that species. So obviously anything that we can do to support owners with their new dogs or dogs that they have or any animal that they've got is obviously helping keep that pet in the home and reduce the number of animals coming into shelter and rescue. And then the flip side of that is none of us who work in shelter and rescue, or I would hope nobody who works in shelter and rescue, want the animals to stay there forever. So what we've got to do is take a dog or a different animal, support them, get them to a place where they're ready to move into their new home, and then support the owner in that new home to make them be successful, to share a great life together, and for that home to become the forever sofa for that dog. So supporting the lead to me is that combination of hopefully preventing animals coming into rescue, but then also making sure that the ones that we put out stay out and have a great life for the owner and the dog. Because I think that's also important is, we've got to look at both ends of the lead when we measure welfare and happiness.
How do you look at this problem? The problem being that dogs coming into rescues, a large amount of them, because of behavior problems. Do you frame it in your head as behavior problems in terms of the dog's got something wrong with its behavior, or is it a resource problem, an environmental problem? How do you think about this?
Oh, it's like a big philosophical question to start off, isn't it? So I use the term problem behavior because I think it's, particularly in the UK, quite widely known, although I would say, labels are labels, aren't they? But I actually think it is a combination. Like sometimes the learning history and other factors of that dog have led them to develop some strategies that might not be ideal in certain situations, particularly if we're thinking of aggressive behaviors or other factors like separation related problems or anything like that, which may not change considerably just by moving the environment. But a lot of the time, actually bringing these animals into rescue and looking at the picture and saying, actually, do you know what? Yes, you had an issue with a child in your previous home for whatever reason, but if we pick you up and plop you into this other home with older children or no children, that's just going to melt away. So I think it is quite a big combination of, sometimes there is that learning history and experience of that individual, or sometimes it can be the environmental shift. So the answer is that ever growing answer of training and behavior of it depends.
Am I remembering correctly? We talked about obviously your experience and knowledge and expertise in the shelter environment, but when we caught up last week, you're kind of suggesting that the conversation today is relevant for the humans whom have the non-human learners that they want to bring to the shelter, most often dogs. But you suggested that it's generalizable to those working with dogs just as a consultant, as a dog trainer?
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of what we do in terms of thinking about the both ends of the lead, it doesn't really matter which angle you're tackling things from. Like I think it's just making sure that owners feel supported and have appropriate goals and thoughts in mind that achieves the outcome that they want. Because ultimately, that's what we're doing, right? Like, yes, we all want to protect welfare of the animal, but if you're being paid for behavioral training services and the owner doesn't get the outcome, we know it happens case by case, but overall, that's how you create a good business model, right? Is people achieving what they want. And same for shelter and rescue. Like if we can keep an animal in the home or make it make it a successful adoption, like it's the same goal. Like how we support our clients, how we bring them along on the journey, I think is universal.
Is that part of the reason you wanted to talk about this today? Do you see um, a misunderstanding about that in terms of people? We talked in the last episode about people being passionate about getting into this. Well, I think we did. Maybe we talked about it after we finished recording, but people get into this industry, they stay in this industry, they want to get involved in this industry because of the passion to help the dogs. But really, at the end of the day, our job is to help people. This is me making a statement. You agree or disagree with it. But like, are you? Do you? Well, firstly, do you agree, disagree with it? And if you agree with it, do you see a lack of that kind of thinking? Is that kind of why you wanted to talk about this as well today?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I definitely agree. Um, and I think, I'm sure we've all heard people say like, oh yeah, I like work with animals because I don't like people. And you always just think, you thought this through? Like animals normally come with people. Oh, and, all right, yeah, they don't in the shelter, but the aim is to get them out again. It's at least my aim. I don't want dogs living in kennels forever. I don't think that's a good approach to welfare personally. And I think that is becoming wider known. But what I also know is and this is another common phrase that people who know me will know, is the dogs are the easy part. Like animals have, generally speaking, quite a set, number of rules when it comes to learning and behavior, and we hopefully now have some good skills to manipulate those. The difficulty is the other end of the lead, taking our knowledge and experience and using that themselves to achieve what they want. So I think it's important because it's, in my opinion, one of the hardest parts of the job is getting everybody on the same page and moving forward towards a good welfare outcome.
Yeah, and just take a second to acknowledge and share with the listeners of this show, like none of the things we're talking about or what we're currently talking about now, we're not suggesting, or I'm not suggesting anyway. And I think that Tom would be the same. Again, tell me if you have different thoughts about it. Like we're not suggesting it's easy, like anything but like it's bloody hard.
Yes. Yeah, it's very tricky. Not really anything that we do is easy, is it?
Yeah, just a nuance. Like someone was saying to me the other day, like if you're in a conversation and you disagree with the other person, you have a different perspective. You see things differently, however you want to frame that. And especially if the disagreement or the different in perspective is, one where the stakes are high, emotions run strong, and opinions vary, which would be the definition of a crucial conversation. You're getting into a challenging conversation about something you really care about. The skill to like not show that in your body language is really challenging. And so like people are consistently doing that. They are and then you're interpreting that correctly or quite often probably incorrectly. Like it gets pretty disorientating and confusing in my experience anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And it varies so much as well, doesn't it? Like how much of that we have to do, or how little of it, or like what choices we can make in those situations, depending on the one we're in. And I always remember back when I worked at a singular rescue center, and they were like, "Oh, can you do some like staff training on like having difficult conversations around like things that are wrong?" So like, and the example was like dominance theory in dogs, and the idea of like being the pack leader, and people coming into the shelter and saying like, "Oh yeah, like yeah, I know I've got to be the alpha in this, that, and the other," and the staff being upset by that or worried about what that would mean for the dog, which may be a valid concern in some situations. And I remember my staff training basically being like, "Do you need to bring it up?" And they were all like, "What?" And I was like, "Well, depending on the situation, like, do we need to bring it up in that moment? Like, thinking about how we address these things, if you directly point things out, does that put them on the defensive? Or, often what I find, particularly when people are coming in and trying to adopt a dog, is they say what they believe you want to hear rather than what they actually believe, or what their experience is, and we're all working off the experience that we've had today. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, is we've all just know what we know, and we hopefully are all open to exploring more things. So I was like, we might steer them in the direction, but rather than say, don't do that because, don't think that because, what we can just do instead is like show them how we do things, and then they can hopefully accept that and take it on. And 90% of the time you're going to avoid those conflict-based conversations but still end up in the same outcome, because obviously what we wouldn't want is somebody to believe that and follow through with dominance theory and start alpha rolling the dog or whatever. That's obviously not what we're talking about. But another example of that was just today, where I was assessing some dogs to, the people wanted to be foster carers for children, and I was assessing their dogs as part of that process. And the owner said to me then, like, "Oh yeah, like when we had this puppy before, we went to this amazing positive reinforcement based trainer, but not one that uses treats." And I was a bit like, "Okay, cool, where's this going?" And she was like, "Oh, you just use like voice and stuff." And I was like, "Oh, cool, yeah, okay, I could like maybe see that working. Cool, yeah." And then she was like, "Yeah," and then she like taught me how to growl, and I was like, "Okay." But what I was there for was to assess the dogs. The dogs were amazing. The owners didn't do anything horrible to the dogs. I don't believe they do. And they just have this kind of different perception. And I also think at that time, like, why would you bring that up in conversation unless you think that is the right thing? And therefore you want me to hear that, because we weren't talking about training. We were just talking about the dogs generally. And obviously I could have said at that point, like, well, that's not what I would like. I wouldn't expect you to growl at your dog. And this is going to be all, this is the long list of negative consequences potentially attached to that. But it wasn't really relevant at the point. So why would I? Which again might sound like quite a strange statement to some of the listeners. But I think like recognizing our ability to influence people outside of direct conflict or pushing against thoughts and considerations is a really strong way to achieve change. And it's something that, I always think about, like, do we need to address this right now, or can we do other stuff that naturally will bring around that point? And I think another good example of this is when maybe people turn up to training sessions in tools that we don't align with personally, like like a prong collar or a choke chain or something like that. And I know some people are really keen to draw that line right at the start of the lesson. But again, does that put people on the defensive? Does that make them think, well, why are you criticizing me about this? Whereas actually, if we say like, hey, can we, this is how we teach the loose lead walking, and we build that relationship and we build that rapport with the client and we build the behavior, and then we say to the client, hey, your dog's walking great, let's try it without, would you like to try this flat collar? And they still have the achievement. You've maybe got around that problem. You've still got around the problem, but you've got around it in a way that empowers the learner rather than starting off with punishment, which I imagine a lot of the listeners wouldn't be doing with the animals. So why are we doing it with the human?
It reminds you of a meme I saw, and it had Jason or Freddy, one of those horror movie characters, right?
Don't ask me, I'm
crying.
crying.
This guy, let's go with the one from Halloween anyway. He's got like a hockey mask on, and he's got like a knife, and he's walking around, and you can see like in the first cartoon the person's hiding behind a wall, and the second cartoon the Halloween guy's moved around, and then in the third one he goes, positive reinforcement doesn't work. And the positive reinforcement trainer goes, yes, it does. Yeah. But the point of the cartoon was how incredibly challenging that skill can be for some people. And tell me what you think. I'm going to throw an idea at you, and you build on it, or if you push back against it, if you see a different perspective. But it comes down to what is our goal in that situation on a couple of levels. Like you said, you were there to just assess the dogs. So that's your goal in that context. Secondly, you also said that if you're talking about the loose leash walking example, and you said if you start to demonstrate or tell them some specific behaviors and skills they can develop, then you start to build rapport and relationship. And if we think about it, we go into these situations to train dogs to get behavior change in dogs. But what we're doing is we're getting behavior change, and we're wanting behavior change in the human. And the human is an earthling, and they operate under the same laws of behavior. Yet we're like, the approximation that we're giving them, or like the tools we're using, like how do you get behavior change? You build rapport, right? And you get relationship, and you put deposits in the trust account. But I feel like we're missing that a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I think we do treat, I was going to say we treat humans like a completely different species, which is obviously the correct phrase. But we treat them like a completely different situation.
Like they're from a different planet where the laws of behavior don't operate.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah. Like and I think actually like positive reinforcement people are the worst for this. Like, I know that's really controversial to say, but yeah, I think, it's interesting, isn't it? We sometimes have this conversation. This is a tangent now, Ryan, but sometimes we have this conversation about like, how far have we gone in positive reinforcement? Like, is it too far? And I don't think it is. Like, that's not what I'm saying, but it's this idea, isn't it, of keeping our minds open and understanding that everybody's on a different part of their learning journey. And our job is to support them to hopefully move closer to where we are. like that's our job, right? As educators, as trainers, or whatever term you choose to use. Like we are there to educate the dog, but also educate the owner. And yeah, that's some of the stuff that we're going to be talking in later. Actually, like comes from the human literature for students, like in schools, because when we take the parallel of learning a new skill, which is what dog training is, it is a skill. Anybody that trains a dog knows that it's hard, especially like if you give me a clicker, it's shocking. I can't deal with a clicker and a handful of treats and a dog lead. Like I'm not really good. I feel like you need to be an octopus. So it is a skill. And if we're teaching a new skill in a stressful environment because somebody feels like they might be being judged or they're worried about their dog's behavior, which is why they've called you in, like one of the great parallels of that is school, where we have this unique group of learners who are being educated.
Yeah, that helped me understand. So
Yeah.
last bit went over my head a little bit.
So, like, I think one element, obviously, a large element of our role is to educate the owners, right? To help them understand where their dog's coming from, but also develop a new skill set, develop new knowledge about their dog as an individual, but maybe about training in general. Um, and one of the largest parallels that we can draw in terms of supporting people in that position is with students. And a lot of the techniques and theories and things that are considered for students in a classroom like can be really helpful for us as dog trainers when we're bringing owners on that learning journey.
And what are some of those skills and ways that we teach students in classrooms? Am I understanding correctly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think one of the big things that we need to think about with owners who we're working with, and I think it's not very often, I mean, I don't hear it talked about a lot, is frustration. So the owner being frustrated in the situation, they're frustrated with their dog, they're frustrated because they can't go on the lovely long walks that they wanted to. They can't do all of the things that they expect they were going to achieve with their dog, or they're embarrassed about the dog because of their behavior. And there was this really cool study from 2023. It was I'm going to butcher this, but it's Character and Nisaf in 2023. And they looked at the frustration of students in a classroom and the influence on motivation and performance. So, obviously, motivation and performance is super important when we're considering how we're helping owners, because if the owners don't want to do what we're asking them to do, then we know they're not going to achieve the same things. And what they kind of looked at was basically the modern world that we're living in, which we obviously talked about in the last episode, is leading to people becoming frustrated more easily. There's a lot more pressure, and that's going to affect how they respond in certain situations. And they basically looked at a big number of students and they split things into kind of three categories, which I'll talk you through in a second. But the reason that frustration becomes important is we get this disengagement in the learning. So people don't want to follow the plans. They're not interested in booking follow-ups or sending us the WhatsApp videos. We get a decreased feeling of self-esteem because they want to achieve what, if you've got a puppy class and your learner is, I don't want to say the bottom of the class because that sounds horrible, but you're seeing the other puppies around you doing well, you're going to feel worried about the image. Why is your pup letting you down? It might be some of the language that they use. And we see this decline in success because of all of these kind of approximations that relate to it. And the other kind of theories that they put forward was, the first one is like the frustration aggression theory. So this is where we see unresolved frustration leads to aggression, which we definitely see in our non-human learners. But when we think about what that actually means for owners stood in front of us, there's potentially where we see things like more negative behavior from the owner coming in. So they might start to shout at their dog or become physical, whether that's intentional or unintentional. So what I mean by that is like maybe they're now reaching for tools that they previously haven't used, like our prongs and our chokes and things, because they're getting to their breaking point, or they feel like they're at the end of the tether and they tried the treats and everything and nothing worked. And then that leads to that breakdown of the relationship between the dog and the owner. And I think it's just something that we don't really think about, is like how we set these owners up for success in their learning plan. really affects the outcome, but also the relationship between the dog and the owner. And I think we talk about it a lot in terms of our non-human learners. So we talk about, keeping our shaping steps small, or building approximations, setting the animal up for success. But I don't think we're as good of doing that with the humans. And I think, that's something that I don't often hear talk about as much is frustration. And particularly with people in the shelter and rescue world, more often than not, they might not be aware of what they're signing up for. Like, we often see behaviors appear in the home that we didn't see in the shelter. And one of the big differences that we have is where you've got somebody who's maybe had a dog from a pup or for a couple of years, and then they start to see the emergence of these behaviors. They've already got that relationship there. But when we've got dogs who are going out of the shelter and this is week 2, the relationship is sort of very different. And obviously, the more support we're able to give them, the better chance that we've got of success.
I don't think I think about this much. So this is really interesting to me. I don't think I think about, maybe I think about it, but I don't think about it through that label.
Mm.
And maybe your answer to my next questions might help me and the listeners as well, I hope, if you are similar to me, unpack this a little bit more. The first question is, how do we know someone's frustrated? And the answer that comes to my mind, and again, an invitation, is paired with this answer for agreeance or pushback, is that we see it through behavior. We guess to the best of our ability that someone's feeling frustrated because we see and hear certain behavior. So for the listeners of this show, and for my personal learning, what behaviors, when we're dealing with owners, I think you might have mentioned some of them already, and that is a lack of behavior maybe. So not sending through WhatsApp videos or showing up to class or whatever, but what other observable, operationalized definitions can you give us for that, and when we're working with clients or working with owners who are surrendering dogs or any other situation?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there are some common phrases that everybody probably will have heard that we can consider. So, that typical one of, well, we've done this before, or we've tried everything, can be quite a clear one where those approximations haven't been met, the goal's not been achieved, and that leads to that frustration. I think body language is the big one in people, as it is with dogs, like crossing arms, disengaging in the conversation, not really making eye contact or paying attention to you. And particularly if you've tried a couple of reps and stuff and it's not been going very successfully, or you're getting to the end of a session. But I generally think as well, it does come through in the feedback. So like you said about not sending through those WhatsApp videos, or just having the one word answers, like, how's things going? Yeah, fine. Yeah, it's okay. So this is another thing that we see with frustration, is that sometimes we still feel like we should be making progress, or we should be achieving things, because we're paying a dog trainer, right? So we're paying you. So of course we're going to tell you things are fine and going well, because it's almost like we don't want to let the dog trainer down. But we're frustrated by the process, so we're not doing the work. So it can be really tricky to kind of take these things apart. And generally speaking, you are going to see it more when success isn't happening, because if everything's going well, then you're not going to be frustrated. But yeah, they're some of the main things is looking out for that language, and then looking at the engagement that you're getting in the programs as well. So if you've given them a diary, how successful are they at filling out the diary? And obviously we talk about ideas around how we can make these things as easy as possible for people to do, so they're not getting frustrated in the first place. But it's looking at outcome a lot of the time, I think.
And I imagine that setting expectations at the start would be valuable there as well. What other ways, you mentioned that obviously we can make things as easy as possible so that frustration doesn't settle in. What ideas do you have to share with the audience about ways that we can do this?
Yeah, so I think the number one thing that we need to do with any client is just create that safe learning environment. So making owners understand like what you're there for, like you said, set expectations from the start about what is likely to achieve, but also really digging down and understanding where they're coming from and making them aware that they can let you know things. So, having open, even simple things like having open body language when you're talking to people. So what I mean by that is like, being mindful if you sit at a desk or you sat writing in a book, like having the book slightly off to the side and not directly in front of you, or not sitting with our arms crossed, or something that's talked about a lot is mimicking. So if the person crosses their leg, you cross your leg, and that's quite an extreme example, but like picking up little things that make them realize that active listening as well. So repeating things back in a slightly different way to check understanding and show that you're listening, and acknowledging, nodding your head, saying yes in the appropriate places, or that those noises that make you sound like you're engaged in the process, which hopefully you are. So creating that safe space is very much kind of that first step. And then I think when we then move on to those appropriate goals, what I'd like to use is kind of borrowed from the like human management side of things, is SMART targets. I just think they're really clear ways that we can get owners on board with our training plans, whatever they are, and then also use those to track. So we can definitely talk about that if that's something you're keen on.
Sounds like a smart thing to do.
Just casually writing it down in my book so I don't get the letters wrong, because as we all know, dog trainers love an acronym.
We do. I love an acronym.
Yeah. So our first one is specific. So making really clear like what our goals are for the training, make them so specific. So the example that I normally use for this is if we are working with an owner of a reactive dog, so a dog that maybe lunges and barks at things, most owners are going to say, I'd like my dog to not be reactive. Most trainers are going to know that's probably not realistic. Like, to say this dog will never ever bark at something again in their lifetime is a pretty big promise to make as a trainer. So it's having that conversation about what the owner actually wants. So how would you feel if you could see a dog coming and cross the road to the other side of the pavement, and your dog not react anymore? And a lot of owners are going to be like, yeah, cool, I just want to be able to walk around the block without my dog barking at everything, right? So changing that, I don't want my dog to react, to I'd like to be able to cross the road and my dog not react, or can my dog sit on the side of the path as another dog passes? Being really clear about what our goal is, making it very specific so everybody knows what they're working towards. And you've also got a bit of an end point, because again, if we say never react again, how many years is that going to take? And most owners, when they start this process, are probably not signed up for that in their head. So that's our first one, is specific. Then we're going to move on to measurable. So we want to understand, again, like, what are we actually looking at here? And that could be simple things like just doing if you're using reactivity, like what a lot of people will say is distance, right? So we can see if we're closer or further away from the dog than we were during the last session. Other things that we can do is even simple, like better, worse, the same charts for walks, or a 5-point scale of like very good, neutral, bad, very bad, just so that we've got something that we can look at. And the reason that this is really important as well is, obviously we want to track progress, we want to know when to adjust plans, but we all know that some of these training journeys with tricky dogs, or dogs with problem behaviors, in the term that we used earlier, but with problem behaviors, it's a long process and it can feel like you're not making very many steps. And sometimes what you've got to do is not only kind of look back to last week, but look at where you started. And I think measuring progress is really important from that point of view, because we can all have bad days where we feel like things haven't gone very well. And I remember seeing a dog with a member of staff maybe 2 weeks ago. And she said, oh, can we go out with this dog? Because, we've been making really good progress with his lunging and barking towards other dogs. But yesterday we went out and he exploded and he was up on his hind legs and it was awful. And I couldn't get him to calm back down. And it was a really horrible situation. And he's been doing so well, but this has happened. So I said, yeah, of course, right, we'll go out with him. And we went out with him and we saw 3 dogs and he didn't react at all. He engaged with the handler. It was beautiful. And honestly, about 3 weeks before this point, this dog was rearing up and like literally screaming, like high pitched vocalization at every dog he saw. And I said to the member of staff then, like, I understand you had a tricky day yesterday. That did sound awful, but you have to recognize how far you've been able to bring this dog. Like, this is amazing from where we were 3 weeks ago. And you're focusing in on the negative, but we've got to see this bigger picture. So I think measurable is really important because we want to understand the journey the owner's on, but also help them recognize the steps that they've taken. And then our A is going to be achievable. So again, like just making it really clear to the owner. And the example that I think of with this really is like, when you go and see those owners and they've got a list of like 10 problem behaviors or 10 training tasks that they want you to achieve in like 3 sessions. So just making it clear like what is actually achievable in the time, helping them focus in, like, do you have a list of priorities? And this is such a random example, but I do use it quite a lot. But say you go to a house and the owners want help with lucid walking, but the dog's toileting in the house. Like, if it's not a priority for the owner, trying to make it our priority probably does put up some of those barriers. And our best bet might be working with the lucid walking and then being like, oh, this has gone really well. I noticed that you may be struggling a bit with house training. Like, would you like my help with that problem? So, like I said, it is a bit of an extreme issue, but understanding that owners have a priority in their head, and even though that might not be our priority, it's our gateway into then further supporting them. So we want to make sure that, whatever we're doing is achievable, and that also involves asking them what they can achieve. So if I create a really intense training plan, which is going to require like 3 sessions a day, 6 days a week, and the owner works full time and has 2 newborns or whatever, that's probably just not going to happen, is it? Like, we know straight off the start. So we can say to them, like, how much time can you dedicate to training? Like, what is a realistic time scale for that? So our R is relevant. So again, like just focusing in on the problem that they're bringing us for. So the example that I always use for this, I feel like is quite a mean one, but a couple of years ago, I saw somebody on Facebook and they were like, can I do a desensitization and counter conditioning plan for 2 dogs who resource God from each other? And I was like, can you tell me a bit more about that situation? So he's like, yeah, when they feed the dogs, they like growl at each other and it has led to a fight. So, could I do a desensitization and counter conditioning plan to gradually get the dogs used to eating near each other? And I was like, well, you could, because it's learning theory, right? But in that time, you're going to put management in place, which is going to be feeding the 2 dogs in separate rooms with a barrier, probably like a sensible place to start. At which point the owner's going to be like, oh, cool, they're not fighting anymore. And then they're probably not going to do the training anyway. So making sure it's relevant, like, to the things we're working on, because that's going to get the owner to engage with it. It's going to make them feel like they are achieving things. And the other extreme example that I sometimes use is like, how useful is a rollover if we're working with separation related problems? So like, it is the extreme version, but basically thinking like, will our training plan actually fit into the goal that we're trying to achieve? Does it move us closer to that goal? And then our last one is time bound. So just making it really clear what our expectations are for the owners. So like, hey, can you send me a video in 2 weeks of the progress that you're making? Or let's book in a call in 2 weeks' time so we can review this. Or right, you've booked a package of 3 sessions, so our next session is X date, and this is what we're going to do. So it's just, again, really clear for the owners what they're working towards, when they need to feed back, and it almost like helps them keep motivated as well, to be like, oh, I've got to send that video soon, so like I'll do a bit of the training, hopefully. And I just think like setting our goals out in that way, and we don't have to like literally write in our report, smart, But just thinking about the conversations we're having about goal setting with our clients and trying to hit these markers, I've personally just found really helpful to getting that buy-in and getting the success, because we just all know what we're working towards and what steps we need to take.
Well, this has been amazing so far. We're talking about ways to help the human side of the lead when working with, quotes, problem behaviors from our non-human learners. I talked about applying the laws of behavior, the tools that we have in our toolkits and our toolboxes that we use with our non-human learners. We talked about using them with the human learners. We talked about noticing and managing frustration in the human learner and why that's important. And we've just talked about SMART goals. What other suggestions, ideas, things do you have to share with our audience, Tom?
Yeah, so the other thing that I think is important is considering the different learning styles. So if people haven't heard of this before, it's kind of up for debate at the minute. It's like a watch this space thing happening. But generally speaking, what people accept is that there's a couple of different learning styles, and the ones that you really hear spoken about is a visual learner, so somebody who learns from watching; a auditory learner, which is somebody who learns from listening; a kinesthetic learner, which is somebody who learns by doing; and then you have like reading and writing people as well, sometimes fit into it. So these are the different learning styles that generally people kind of fit into, normally more than one, but for different skills, we learn in these ways. So what I like to think about when I'm talking to somebody or showing somebody some dog training things is a process called like tell, show, watch, test, signpost. So it's quite a long one, and there's no cool acronym to come with it. But the thought behind it is that we're hitting all of those learning styles. So tell is obviously explain what you're going to do. So we're going to teach a hand touch behavior. This is really useful because it's a way to redirect our dog onto something else. And how you do that is you put your hand out with a treat between your fingers, and the dog sniffs it, and you mark it and say yes, and blah blah blah. You're explaining the process of the training. We're then going to show them, which is kind of as it sounds on the tin. So you show them the training for them to watch and take in, and then you watch them do it. And this is often the tricky part, because normally if you say to owners, would you like to have a go now? They go, no, it's okay. I understand what you mean. Or I'm not really keen. Or they do it a bit funny because they're worried about you observing them. And it's something that actually I've found really difficult myself, is like if owners are like, no, thank you, I'm just like, oh, okay then. But actually, like if you haven't watched them do it, you miss that opportunity for feedback. You miss the opportunity to actually check they've understood the task. So the way that I started doing it instead, which came from a friend of mine, and a couple of other good instructors. So what you do is you don't make a big thing out of it. So you demo it for them, and you might do it once or twice, and say we're teaching that hand touch example. So I've shown them a few times, and then what I'm going to say is, right, okay, can you just pick up that treat, or take a treat out of your bag? So they do that bit, and then you say, right, okay, can you put it between your fingers? They do that. Right, put your hand out. Dog does the behavior. You say, yeah, okay, mark it again. So you've got them to do it because you've just asked them to do things in small steps, rather than saying, would you like to have a go now? So same if we're doing loose lead walking, you'd say, right, okay, can you just hold this lead a second? Right, great. Right, count out 5 treats in your hand. Yeah, okay, right. Feed your treats, feed your dog 3 treats. Okay, take one step forward and then mark and feed your dog. Whatever your example is, we don't just say, can you do it now? We just encourage them through action. And then test is, we're watching it, we've watched that, we've fed back a little bit, and then signpost. So after the session, I'm going to email you a video of how to do this exercise. Or if you go to the Animal Training Academy website, there's some great information about how you can continue this process. So we're hitting all of those learning styles, which should again help empower our learners. It creates that safe space because they hopefully feel more open to ask questions, because we've hopefully hit the different areas of their learning so they're more able to form questions in their head, if that makes sense. So like if I learn by watching, but you've just explained it to me, I don't know what questions to ask you because I haven't started that learning process because we're not in the same section. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you know what it's making me think about? And
Yeah.
and that's tag teach, which is
Yeah.
that I'm level one tag teacher. There's 3 levels, so like I'm a little mini beginner tag teacher. But part of what we have to do to get level one tag teach certification is send through some videos. Basically, doing that process is telling in a very specific way with that particular um, curriculum using the tag teach methodology. So they've got their own tag teach has its own wording, etc., etc. But yeah, going through that process, and I think that part at the end was really smart, like just breaking that behavior down into small, achievable. Reminds me of something, Tom. What does that remind me of? Breaking behavior down into small, achievable approximations.
It's like what we do with every other species, right?
Holy crap. And that's amazing. I think that's really valuable. So it was tell, show, watch. What was the next one?
Tell, show, watch, test, and signpost. So
Test,
that's like the
test, and
whole
signpost. Yep.
process. And test is an odd one because it might not appear every time, right? So if you've watched a client do it, you're naturally going to give feedback unless they've like just perfectly executed your training technique. It fits more into like when you're teaching other people one-on-one, or what you might do is ask them a question about the process. So cool, okay, so like at what point would you click the clicker? And hopefully the person should say, oh yeah, when his nose touches my hand. Okay, cool, yeah, you know what you're doing. So it might be asking a question around the exercise or the learning just to check that understanding, basically. So we've watched them do it, but also we know that they kind of know the next steps or when to give the treat or whatever your question is. And then our signpost is directing them to more information because if they are like me and they're going to go down a massive ADHD rabbit hole about whatever you've just talked about, they know where to look and they're not just finding random trainers on the internet.
I know you use Portal, Tom, and you're teaching at the
Mm.
PPG British Isles Summits. I always have to like just pause and like catch myself to say that mouthful. Last year, maybe you and I were talking about then at the summit, but there is an exercise where people are learning reinforcement systems in Portal, and they just have to so you've got a teacher and a learner, and the teacher has to either click and pass the block or just pass the block to the learner, and they're timed for 6 seconds, and they count how many times they can do in 6 seconds, and you times that by 10, and then you get rate of reinforcement for a minute with that specific reinforcement system and those specific learner and teacher. And I've found after doing that exercise many, many times that I have to say at the start, this is not a test. We are here for learning, and this is just an exercise for learning. You're not trying to trick your learner. You're not trying to manipulate this exercise in any way. There's no right or wrong. So I'm curious, when you're testing people, like, how do you select what to test? Are you I'm just curious how I would which I'm going to experiment with what you've just shared with us, and how I would choose what questions I'm going to ask to, one, not make the person feel like they're being tested, because there's all this like learning history and baggage from school and like exams and all of this stuff that like comes flooding back, right? And then two, like, do you want to like, are you intentionally like wanting them to be successful, so you're going to ask them something that's easy so they get it right? Or are you like, oh, let's challenge this person and see if they've actually been listening? And last thing, and I'm going to shut up. And I'm assuming that you're doing it based on the individual learner in front of you. So you're making a judgment call based on that information, not just a generic rule.
Yeah, so I mean, they're all great questions. And I think it comes back to what we said as point number one, being like creating that safe environment. So, I wouldn't do this with somebody we've just met. This is somebody that we've spent a bit of time with. We've done some training already. And we have that bit of a rapport anyway, so that hopefully they don't feel put under the spotlight. Obviously, we know that is still the case. So it's also then about how you word the question. So you might start off with something that you hopefully know they will get the answer right to, um, like that example that we just used of, like, what point are you going to give the dog the treat if you're teaching a hand touch? If you've done a couple of times and the dog's nose has touched their hand, you'd hope they would say, "Oh, when they touch my hand." Or it might even have to be a simpler question to start with. But really, the questions are there to check that understanding. And I think it's the way that we therefore put that across, and then the way we reinforce it if they do get the answer wrong, which again sounds weird, doesn't it, when we're talking about training, because we normally wouldn't reinforce wrong answers. But it's about the language we use to then give them the information that they were lacking. So I wouldn't be like, no, that's you've got that wrong. It'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see your perception of that, or that's really interesting. But if you think about it this way, or if you do that, like that might help you next time. So it's about you do want to check understanding, because then if the understanding's incorrect or different to what you were hoping they would take away, you can obviously steer them back in the right direction. And because of that, yes, it would be down to the individual learner. So looking at the type of relationship you've got, how successful they've been, and what I would say is, like we just kind of mentioned, you'd you wouldn't just be testing straight away. It would be like, right, we'll do a couple of repetitions. We've done a bit of feedback. We're at the end of the session. You've explained your next steps, and it'll be like, right, okay, what's your plan for tomorrow? So say we were teaching a recall and we've said, right, start in the garden. We're going to build up your recall in the garden before you take it out on a long line. Yeah, okay, great. Okay. All right. So what's your step going to be tomorrow? And then they might take a minute to think about it, but hopefully they say, well, I'm just going to start in the garden because we haven't done any recall. So you're just rephrasing what you've said into a question is basically the way to think about it, I suppose.
Super valuable, and for you, the listener, just want to reiterate that none of this stuff is easy and it takes time. Thinking back to Tom, when you're talking about some methods, want to be careful of my word use here, because if this stuff's new to you, it can come across as manipulative. Like, oh, I want to mirror the person's body language, and it can be like, like, so like if this is all new to you, like it's gonna feel really weird and awkward. Like if you're even if you're doing this show, sorry, let me get it right, tell, show, watch, test, signpost, like like you have to kind of treat yourself as a learner too, right? Because you're doing a new behavior that has no reinforcement history, and you're basically replacing whatever behavior you used to do in that context that has reinforcement history and that worked for you for whatever reason, even though it might have been inefficient for the client. If you've been operating in a certain way, that's because you are reinforced with doing this, and you potentially and I love that you listen to this podcast because you're looking for a wider skill set, and you need to build skill set, and you need to get reinforcement history. So you're gonna have to muddle your way through it, and it's going to feel awkward, and it's a little bit of brave learning. It takes courage, I think, to adapt some of these things. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think what we forget sometimes as well is that most people are generally good active listeners. Like there's not many people who on. It just depends in the context. So it's not that you're not probably doing it anyway, but it's just thinking about the perception to the other person. So you do it during the podcast, Ryan. I say something and then you repeat it back in a slightly different way to check your understanding. And that gives me the chance to just be like, yes, that's exactly what I meant. And for an owner who's talking to us about that dog, that can be really reassuring. It can be really like gratifying. It makes them feel heard, it makes them feel understand. So a lot of this stuff that we talk about, people probably are naturally doing. It's just about honing it and thinking about the effect it then has on the client, to take away. Because I agree with you, like I've sat there like actively thinking about mirroring, and it's really weird. Like somebody moves the pen and you're
Yeah.
just like, should I move my pen, is that too much? Like,
Yeah,
are they going to cotton on? This is what I'm doing.
yeah, it's like gotta
But
blink
it's
at the
just
same time
things
as them.
like, yeah, and it's things like watching. So sometimes I'm massively going to generalize here, but sometimes you get a consultation and it's a couple, and the lady's kind of brought the partner, the male partner, along, and he's sat in the corner with his arms crossed, and then gradually over time, as you build that rapport, you see him open up, um, and you're just kind of trying to create that for everybody, I suppose, and that would be a good point where you then opening up and relaxing would also reinforce um, the opening up from that other person. And then that's probably a point where you'd start aiming more questions towards the male owner versus the female owner, or you'd try and get them a bit more involved in the training or whatever the situation was. And it's generally when they start to realize that you're on their side, and hopefully they are going to get out of this what they wanted and not just being dragged along to it. Like I said, that is a massive like simplification and generalization, but us men are quite good at shutting down.
And every time, listen, just take note. Every time I mirrored something back to Tom, he said, "Yes, that's exactly what I meant," because I'm so amazed. No, but I don't always get it right. Like I had to ask for clarification
Mm.
about the student learning example. Hey, we've run out of time, Tom. Just one last question before we wrap up today. I always like to hear, and this is something that I think could be a strength of yours. We talked about it in part one, people's vision for the future. So, what would you really like to see happen in the next 5 to 10 years in the shelter industry and in our much larger industry of people that work with animals and are interested in behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. My big one for the shelter, I think, is shelters and rescues just being more open. I see it a lot where there's like this perception that it's really hard to adopt and it's really difficult to adopt, and people go and get puppies because they can't get a rescue dog. And I think it's a big passion of mine that we should be moving away from that being the truth. And I think it is in a lot of places, but all of the things that we've talked about demonstrate how difficult it is for dog owners or dog guardians at the minute, and dogs. Um, and I often just think, like, when we hear things like, oh, you can't work full time and have a dog, well, how do you afford vet care then? Or, like, the dogs can never be left, or you have to have a 7 foot fence or something, but actually the people have no intention of leaving the dog in the garden because they go for a walk 3 times a day. And I just think, like, we should have a flexible approach to adoption, because A, people can just go out and buy a puppy and there's no pre-questionnaire for that. And B, like, the number of animals that we can help, and something that we talk about a lot on this theme is the good enough home. So, like, often we end up looking for this needle in a haystack home, like, oh, can they live in the middle of nowhere with no visiting children or this, that, and the other, and never left. But actually, most dogs are going to have a great life in a good enough home. Like, when I first had my dog, I didn't have a garden. We just went for more walks than we do now because now we've got a garden, like, you can work with people to get good outcomes. So that's my big one for sheltering, is supporting a flexible approach. And then the wider world, like, just like us to all be able to have conversations like adults, really. It's quite a big one, but I think it's important at the minute.
It is, but it's not. Again, it's not. I feel like it's challenging to talk about things that the stakes are so high for these
Mm.
dogs and the people involved, and we care so much. And when you throw in different personalities and opinions there, it gets hard to adult. Adulting can be hard sometimes, Tom.
It's very hard.
But yes, no, I agree. And hopefully some of the things we've talked about in these last few episodes it gives some ideas or areas or some signposts for going and looking at other ways to build your skill and knowledge. And I like that good enough home. Reminds me of we did a podcast episode years ago with Nancy Tucker, who talked about the good enough dog, and
Mm.
that was really helpful for a lot of people to just let go of some of the pressures that one puts on themselves to have a air quotes perfect dog. Like you just need a dog that is good enough for you in your home, and the client needs a dog that's good enough for them. in their home. Shout out to the awesome Nancy Tucker. Well, hey, Tom, this has been so much fun. So just before we finish up, I nearly forgot. Just remind everyone listening where they can go online to say hi and find out more about what you do.
Yeah, so the best place is simplifyingshelterbehaviour.com, and you can spell that the right way, the British way, or you can spell it the American way. So it doesn't matter if you have a U or don't have a U in behaviour, it should still come up. And then, yeah, same for the podcast and Facebook. So Simplifying Shelter Behaviour.
There's no right or wrong ways. there's better and worse. No, just jokes. Thanks so much, Tom. We really appreciate everything that you're doing for the dogs that you work with, the humans that you work with, and for helping spread information, build knowledge, and build skills. So thank you for all that you do and for hanging out with us at ATA.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you so much for listening as well. This is your host, Ryan Cartledge, signing off from this episode of the Animal Training Academy podcast show. We hope today's conversation inspired you and equipped you with new tools for your trainer's toolbox. Remember, every challenge in training is an opportunity to learn and sharpen your animal training geekery. Embrace the rough patches, learn from them, and keep improving. And don't forget, the path to growing your skills and expanding your knowledge continues beyond this episode. Visit www.atamember.com to join our supportive membership, where you will find a community of trainers just like you. Together, we're making a huge positive difference in the lives of animal and human learners worldwide. Until next time, keep honing your skills, stay awesome, and remember, every interaction with an animal or human learner is your opportunity to create ripples. We're here cheering you on every step of the way. See you at the next episode.